Chapter 9. The Big Surprise Ending. It was almost the time for my favorite part of the day, dismissal. Everybody was gathering up their pencil cases and backpacks. That's when Mrs. Ba came into our classroom. She was wearing the mask I made in art class. I just wanted to say goodbye, she said. We are going to miss you, everybody said. Some of the kids went over to give Mrs. Ba hugs. I'm going to miss you too, she said as she went over and opened the window. Where are you going to travel next? Asked Ryan. Oh, I don't know, Mrs. Ba replied. Maybe Istanbul, that's in Turkey. Istanbul is the only major city that is in two continents. You can actually stand with one foot in Asia and one foot in Europe. Cool, everybody said. Or maybe I will go to Indonesia, said Mrs. Ba. Did you know that Indonesia has more than 13,000 islands? Asterisk. That must be where Thousand Island dressing comes from. Bring! The dismissal bell rang. That's when the weirdest thing in the history of the world happened. Mr. Claus came into our classroom. Well, that's not the weird part. Mr. Claus comes into our classroom all the time. The weird part was what happened next. This has been a wonderful week, Mrs. Barr, said Mr. Claus. I wanted to thank you for giving up your valuable time and teaching our students about geography. I have had a lovely week, said Mrs. Barr. Thank you for letting me visit your school. And you will never believe who burst through the door at the moment. Nobody. You can't burst through a door. When are you going to learn? But you'll never believe who burst through the doorway. It was the four policemen. Freeze, dirtbag! One of them shouted. You're under arrest. Who's under arrest? We all shouted. The police officers pointed at Mrs. Ba. Gasp! Everybody gasped. What did Mrs. Ba do? Asked Mr. Claus. She's the notorious globe-trotting jewel thief, said one of the officers. I knew it, I shouted. Oh, she's a clever one, the officer continued. We've chased her from England to Italy to Asia and across the Pacific Ocean. She hides out in schools wherever she goes. Every time we are about to catch her, she slips away. But now we've finally nabbed her. Mrs. Ba, you've gone too far, one of the other cops said. There must be some mistake, Mr. Cooper said. Mrs. Ba is just a nice lady I met on a vacation. Oh, yeah? Said one of the officers as he grabbed Mrs. Ba's suitcase. Let's have a look in here. She keeps her doggy underwear collection in there, Andrea shouted. Sure she does, the officer said as he opened the suitcase and picked up some doggy underwear, but underneath, the suitcase is filled with stolen jewels. See? He held up a fistful of necklaces and bracelets. Gasp! Everybody gasped. I told you, I shouted. Nobody needs a whole suitcase to carry their doggy underwear. What do you have to say for yourself, Mrs. Ba? Asked Mr. Claus. But, she shuddered. We all giggled because Mrs. Ba said but, which sounds just like a but, even though it only has one T. You like taking trips, lady? One of the officers asked. Well, you're going to take another trip to jail. How interesting, said one of the other officers. Her name is Ba, and that's what she's going to be behind the bars. Not if I can help it, shouted Mrs. Ba, and you'll never believe what happened next. You'll never catch me, coppers, Mrs. Ba yelled as she grabbed her suitcase. Then she ran over to the open window and jumped out of it. Gasped, we all gasped. Get here, shouted the cops. They all jumped out of the window and chased Mrs. Ba into the street. Sayonara, she hollered as she ran away. Over. Arrivederci. off window stand. Adios, amigos. Nobody said anything for a long time. It was Mr. Cooper who broke the silence. I feel terrible, he said. I had no idea that Mrs. Barr was a thief. She seemed like such a nice lady. That's okay, Mr. Cooper, said Mr. Klotz. Nobody could have guessed that Mrs. Barr was a criminal, said Andrea. Hey, I guessed she was a criminal, I shouted at Andrea. I tried to tell you, but you thought I was crazy. AJ was right all along, said Michael. Now we know why Mrs. Barr had that suitcase with her all the time, said Alexia. And now we know why she opened the window every time she came into a room, said Neil. So she could jump out of it if the police showed up. It seems so obvious now, said Ryan, but except for AJ, we fell for it hook, line, and sinker. Why is everybody always talking about fish? Andrea had on her mean face. I knew why she was mad, because I was right and she was wrong. This was all your fault, Arlo, she said. What? If you had been able to find Spain on the map, said Andrea, Mrs. Barr would have never come to our school in the first place. My fault? I shouted. You believed everything Mrs. Barr said. I'm the only one who knew she was a thief. Oh, said Ryan. AJ and Andrea are having a spat. They must be in love. When are you gonna get married? Asked Michael. If those guys weren't my best friends, I would hate them. Well, that's pretty much what happened. Maybe Mr. Cooper will stop showing us boring pictures from his vacations. Maybe the Great Lakes will stop bragging about how great they are. Maybe Dr. Brad will stop calling himself Frank. Maybe grown-ups will put on moisturizer so they don't have to rub their foreheads so much. Maybe everybody will stop talking about fish for no reason. Maybe the police will finally catch Mrs. Barr and put her in jail. Maybe dogs will stop wearing underwear, but it won't be easy.